Hi, this is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to do something pretty different today. We're going to open up some real tracks and hear some real masters I've done for clients. We're starting this new series called First Look, where we take an early look at a new piece of hardware, software, some cool gear coming out. And today it's going to be a pretty special one because it is a piece of software I use literally every day in my mastering work, and that is iZotope's Ozone. They're now out in Ozone 9. Now, I don't actually master all of my tracks completely in Ozone, but I wager that I could, and that's actually what I'm going to do today. I'm going to take 3 different tracks I've mastered for clients. These are real commercial releases. Clients really signed off on them, loved the sound of them, and I'm going to see if I can replicate the sound of those using nothing but Ozone. And what are the results like? Is it going to work? Is it good enough? You tell me. You can hear for yourself, and I'll also link in the show notes in the description of this video to where you can hear the original masters that I did for these clients. So you be the judge. I think it gets really, really close, really, really fast. I'm also going to walk you through a lot of the new features in Ozone 9, but even if you've never heard of Ozone, I think this is going to be a great video for you today because you'll get to hear what I really do to clients' masters to take them from where they start to where they finish. All right, without further ado, let's dive right in. So let's start off with this first track. It is by an artist who goes by the name of Filian, a guy named Mher Filian. He's been a producer and songwriter for some pretty big artists, the likes of Selena Gomez and Demi Lovato. So really big stuff. And this is probably going to be the poppiest of the 3 tracks we're going to listen to today. And this one is going to give us a really good look at some of the tools that I use all the time in Ozone, particularly the dynamic EQ. Let's pull it right up. Now you can see here on my screen for the first time, this is a new feature to iZotope's Ozone. You can full screen this bad boy. So that's pretty cool. In the past, you had a fixed screen width in iZotope's Ozone, and now we can get all the real estate that we want. All right, there's a couple new modules that I'm going to show you in a minute. There's some really great stuff in here. The Mastery Balance tool is mind-blowing. It's almost like having access to stems on mixes where you don't really have access to stems. There's the Match EQ, a new module in Ozone 9. And then there's even the fact that you can add more modules to Ozone than you used to be able to do in the past. And that's really how I use Ozone most of the time, is just cracking it open in a DAW and then just grabbing the modules of my choice. But today, I'm going to be using the standalone iZotope Ozone app and trying to master all of these tracks using nothing but iZotope Ozone modules. To start with, let's hear what this track sounds like by itself. I'll jump you right into a chorus and we'll kind of listen together and hear what needs to change in this track. So you make notes as you're listening on what you think needs to change, and let's decide if they're the same things together. Ideally, you'll be listening to this on good speakers, good headphones, but honestly, even on iMac speakers, you can probably get a good sense for what's changing with and without Ozone. But if you have access to some good speakers or good headphones, put them on. All right, here we go.
Keeps me up in the middle of the night, spinning around my head like a satellite. 'Cause I see your face running through my mind. Woulda, coulda, shoulda, story of my life. Keeps me up in the middle of the night, spinning around my head like a satellite.
And already the mix is pretty good. The 2 things that I'm noticing is for this genre, I like to hear the vocal a little bit more forward than what happened in this mix. And I think that on some systems, those high claps and later on there's like a high triangle might get a little overbearing on certain sets of tweeters. The way that I'm hearing them, they poke out a little bit. They might not have poked out a little bit on his speakers. That's what we're trying to do in mastering, is to figure out the things that the mixer wasn't hearing perfectly on their system and seeing if we can kind of address those and even those out. So how can I keep those claps sounding interesting and make the vocal come forward without compromising too much on either? The big trick on this one is something that's not new to Ozone 9, but it's one of my favorite things in the world, so I've got to show it off, and that is the dynamic EQ. Let's listen to this section again before and after mastering. I think you can hear there's not actually a big level change here. There didn't need to be. Let's listen back.
Keeps me up in the middle of the night,
4.
spinning around my head like a satellite. 'Cause I see your face running through my mind. Woulda, coulda, shoulda, story of my life. Keeps me up in the middle of the night, spinning around my head like a satellite. 'Cause I see your face running through my mind. Woulda, coulda, shoulda, story of my life.
So I think you'll hear there's a fairly significant difference there. There's not actually too huge of a level jump going on in this master, and later we'll hear it gain matched so you can get an even better sense for what's happening. But if you check out the dynamic EQ, there's actually fairly significant dips here happening. One of them that is targeted towards the high end on those claps, and one that's targeted on the high end of a kind of triangle-y hi-hat sound that'll come in a later course. We'll hear that in a second. And they're really adding some smoothness and control there, letting the vocal come forward without totally neutering those high sounds, but without them poking out too much. Now, these settings may look a little extreme on the readout here, but there's not a lot going on. I mean, the most we're doing here is a 2 dB cut in EQ, and really only when that clap snare is hitting. It's really only being triggered by that instrument. So the threshold is set, so it's only triggering up to 2 dB of reduction when that thing hits. So it looks like a big dip, but it's really fairly subtle, fairly transparent. The other great thing in Ozone is that you can automate pretty much any single button you're going to see inside of Ozone. If you are in the DAW of your choice, pretty much any of them can be automated. So you can really just turn on a dynamic EQ like this just in the section where you need it and leave it off elsewhere for even more transparency and even more control when you need it. Let's dive into a slightly later chorus to hear some more. Here's the original.
Back with it.
And you can hear what's happening is pretty much everything is coming up except for that high triangle. Even our background vocals are getting a little bit more forward, a little bit more spread. Now, I'm using quite a few modules here. There's also an EQ doing some small changes here, really darkening up the top end. And then we've got the dynamic section doing a little bit of serial compression. I'll talk about that a little later. The exciter doing a little bit of saturation to get the sound that I'm used to from working on the analog desk at Joe Lambert Mastering for so long with so much of that great analog gear. And then one of my other favorites, the stereo imager. And I'll talk a little bit more about this on a later track. Last but not least, there is the limiter. All of this stuff has existed in past versions of Ozone. None of this is new to Ozone 9. But I do want to show off a couple of tools I didn't actually use on this master that are new to Ozone 9 that are just absolutely crazy. And one of them is this new feature called Master Rebalance. And this, I kid you not, allows me to go in and treat this master as if I had stems, independently turning up the vocals, up and down the vocals, up and down the bass, up and down the drums. Let's check that out.
Back with it.
I think that's pretty incredible. The vocal is really coming up and down without us hearing a lot of changes in other areas. The same thing can happen for bass and drums. Let's check this out in the original chorus.
Keeps me up in the middle of the night, spinning around my head like a satellite. 'Cause I see your face running through my mind. Woulda, coulda, shoulda, story of my life. Keeps me up in the middle of the night, spinning around my head like a satellite.
And we can do the same thing with the drums.
Keeps me up in the middle of the night, spinning around my head like a satellite. 'Cause I see your face running through my mind.
And you can hear it really focuses in on just that drum sound without affecting other things too much. I found it surprisingly transparent, even at some pretty significant settings, and you kind of got to push it all the way for it to sound anywhere remotely bad. So this is something that I could see myself using on future masters. Man, this thing just came out like a couple of weeks ago, so I haven't put it on any commercial masters yet, but I gotta tell you, this is going to be one of those modules that when I need it, and I just want to get that bass and tuck it down a hair or bring the vocal out a hair more, I could see myself using this thing. So really impressed with this, and I think that's probably worth the price of admission alone to Ozone 9. That's the Master Rebalance tool. Another kind of cool one is this low-end focus tool, and this allows us to change the proportions between bass and drums, which is something that I think about a lot when I'm mastering. As I turn the contrast up in punchy mode, I think you'll hear the attack of the kick drum come out a bit more. And as I turn the contrast up when I'm in smooth mode, I think you'll hear that bass come up a bit more. So it's allowing us to almost separate the two major elements in the low end. Let's check it out. Wow, so I mean that punchy mode and adjusting the contrast, it's almost like having a little bit of a fader on the kick drum I can turn up and down. You can also change what EQ range you're affecting with the low end focus right here. So some really cool tools right there. Next, we're going to jump into a track, very different vibe. This is one by an artist named Hally. Also a great producer engineer, this guy based out of Ireland, and his solo works have come out under the name Hally. Really gorgeous track, gorgeous singer-songwriter. Let's hear this one first with absolutely no processing.
Here I'm lying on my bed, crazy things inside my head, and all I'd like to do is fall asleep. And here I'm lying on my bed, crazy things inside my head, and all I'd like to do is fall asleep for a week.
Wow, really beautiful voice, really beautiful writing. There's a great arc to this one. And one of the things I want to do here is keep this fairly dynamic. And I've got to say that just listening to this track by itself with no context, it doesn't really feel like it has any problems that need to be solved. What comes up on the mastering end is when I get together with the artist and we're figuring out what this record should sound like, we're inevitably listening next to some of their favorite records. And when we hear this against other commercial masters that this should really sit well on the shelf next to, it's just a little bit darker, a little bit more muted sounding. And like I said, although it's gorgeous by itself, it really has to sit next to the whole literature of recorded music in a way that makes sense and is still inspiring. And what that means in this context, this happens on a lot of masters, just needs to get a little bit brighter and a little bit more clear, a little bit more articulate. We've got to open it up a little bit without sacrificing the kind of beautiful, rich smoothness that's there. So the most significant thing going on this particular track is EQ. And let's hear what's happening, and then I'll show you what's going on. So here it is again without any changes.
Here I'm lying on my bed, crazy things inside my head, and all I'd like to do is fall asleep. And here I'm lying on my bed, crazy things inside my head, and all I'd like to do is fall asleep for a week.
Again, we're really not trying to fix anything. We're just trying to bring out some articulation, some detail, so you can kind of hear deeper into the track. Now, these look like some pretty bold EQ moves, but in reality, they're not. Mastering EQs are usually designed to make it look like you're EQing a lot when you're not. They've kind of gotten rid of some of the readouts here on the bottom on Ozone 9 that show you exactly how much of the boosts and cuts are, and you can bring them back pretty easily just by clicking here. So you can have a really uncluttered interface if you like that more intuitive feel, or if you like to look at the numbers, which I do, I like to type them right in. You can just open up this window. And you can see the changes I'm making. There is just over 2 dB cut around 280 hertz, about a 2 dB cut around 450 hertz, some very tiny gooses up in the upper mid-range and high frequencies, and a tiny little bit of low-end roll-off. This kind of thing is not uncommon in mastering, and I'd say probably anywhere from 60 to 80% of tracks that get mastered need to get a little bit brighter. And that is one of the most common things happening. Often a little bit of cut in lower mid-range, maybe a little goosing up in the upper mid-range and the high frequencies. that's something that is very common to mastering. Exactly how much to cut and exactly what frequencies and with how wide of a bandwidth, well, that comes down to taste, skill, and ears. There is no one right answer. There's no one right way to master a track, but the more you do this, the more informed your decisions are going to be. And of course, you don't want to just go in and throw in this kind of processing if it's the last thing the track needs. What the track actually needs is to get darker. So one of the other cool things here is, again, we're not changing the level too much. I've brought down, I'm adding maybe 5 dB of level. And on the real final master of this, I did use the limiter that is built into Ozone. And I actually automated this limiter and automated the level of the track to allow me to not compress too much in the loudest sections while bringing up the level on the quieter sections. And again, the ability to automate anything in Ozone is fantastic there. Let's listen to this passage one more time, this time with gain match turned on, so we can hear exactly what's changing without the big boost in level that's going on. Here's the before.
Here I'm lying on my bed, crazy things inside my head, and all I'd like to do is fall asleep. And here I'm lying on my bed, crazy things inside my head, and all I'd like to do is fall asleep.
So I think you really hear the difference there. It opens up, it becomes a little bit more bright and alive. And here is one of the things I want to let you know. There is no exactly right EQ curve for any track, ever. What there is an EQ curve that makes sense based on the taste of the artist, the tastes of the engineer, and kind of the milieu of records that are out there that this thing is going to be heard against out in the wild. And that was a big thing. We listened to a few different references just to get a sense for, hey, where should this sit? Should we go even darker with this? Oh, if we should go brighter with this, how much brighter should we go? And that's something you need to get on the same page with the artist about. Now, Ozone can help you make those kinds of decisions and steer you in a possible direction for an EQ setting. And there is now broken out, this is new in Ozone 9, something called Match EQ. And Match EQ used to be something in earlier versions of Ozone that was built into the EQ, but it lets you actually listen to a reference track and it'll suggest ways of EQing the track to get it closer to your reference. It's a great starting point and it's super easy to use. All you've got to do is go over here to the reference section and upload a reference track. I've uploaded the original final master to this. Super easy to do. You just got to find it on your hard drive and upload it. And I've just gone ahead and selected the same section in this track. And now, this is so easy. In Ozone, all you've got to do is click this little button here next to reference, and all of a sudden you're listening to the reference instead of the original track.
I'm lying on my bed, crazy things inside my head.
And in this case, you can hear the reference sounds really, really close to the final master we came up with. All right, I'm going to turn off my EQ settings and have Ozone suggest to us some EQ settings that'll get these two tracks to sound a lot closer together. And it's super easy to do in Match EQ. I'm going to turn on my reference, and as we are listening to the reference, I'm just going to hit this capture button. Now, in the interest of time, I just went ahead and captured them off screen, but here is the result. The original and reference EQ curves you can see right here, and then here's a recommended EQ curve, and you can see it's dipping down a little bit below, say, the 80 hertz region. There's a little bit of a suggested dip around 300 hertz and a little lift up in the upper mid-range and high end, which is kind of what we did. Another cool thing here is that you can take these little handles here and apply this Match EQ just to certain areas of the track. So another really cool feature and an update in Ozone 9 that wasn't available in the past. All right, let's hear one more track. Again, totally different approach here. This is a track by an artist named Piesse. And Bonnie, in addition to being a wonderful singer-songwriter, one of her claims to fame is that she played Aunt Beru in the new versions of Star Wars. Yes, a young Aunt Beru. For those of you who are giant Star Wars nerds like myself, you'll be super pleased by that factoid. So let's check this out. Bonnie Piesse, wonderful track here called Found off of her new EP. I didn't master her last EP, and I listened to her last EP, and it sounded great. Her last EP, though, sounds different than this new one. We want to go a little bit in a darker direction on this new 4-song EP. I still wanted to go a little brighter than the original, but I wanted to do it in a way that was going to keep things somewhat dark and smooth compared to her prior EP. And on this track in particular, I'm making great use of the multiband compression that is built into Ozone, as well as this lovely stereo imager. Let's hear the before on this track.
You broke my heart. I fell through the night, but I found myself. You broke my heart. I fell through the night, but I found myself.
Wonderful. And I think what you can really hear the change here is in the top end of the vocal. Again, an EQ going on here that might look pretty significant on screen, but if you see here, all that's really happening, a dB.5 boost down here in the subs, and then I'm trying to add some control to the bass. And then there's, again, a couple little 2 dB-ish dips in the lower mid-range, a little bit of softening in the upper mids on this one, and then this luscious boost here in the high frequencies. And this boost in the high frequencies is coupled with a little bit of a dip in this area. So on this track is a little bit more about bringing the low end and high end into better balance. I wanted to keep things big and dark and luscious and smooth, but I wanted to bring the low end into balance, bringing the subs up a little bit more and bringing down the upper bass a little bit. Listen to this track again and listen for that key distinction of there being a little bit more control on the bass, but without us losing depth and thickness. And then with the voice getting a little bit more top end air. Here again is the before.
You broke my heart. I fell through the night, but I found myself. You broke my heart. I fell through the night, but I found myself.
And I think you'll also be able to hear this change pretty significantly even when we gain match it. Before we do that, let's take a look at what's going on in this imager. In the stereo imager, we're taking the higher frequencies, everything above about 200 hertz in this case, and just spreading it out and making it a little bit wider. But we're taking all of the low frequencies below 200 hertz and actually centering them more and bringing them more into focus. This is a kind of tool that I loved. I fell in love with Joe Lambert mastering. He had an analog version of this, I believe, on his Maselec console. It was called an elliptical filter. This was very common in the vinyl cutting days, where you could center your low frequencies more, but spread out frequencies above it. And I love that I'm able to do that in Ozone. I could also create additional bands, I think up to 4 bands of stereo imaging. So I could take different parts of the frequency spectrum and either kind of center them a little bit more or let them expand. The other thing that's going on here is a multi-band compressor, like I mentioned. We actually have 3 separate bands going on here. We have one band for frequencies, again, above 200 hertz, and that's kind of like my everything compressor. But the low end wanted to be brought into a little bit more balance, and I wanted to compress that bass separately from everything else and kind of smooth out some of its resonances and bring it into a little bit more control. So I'm able to compress the sub bass and the upper bass a little bit separately. Let's listen to it again, this time gain matched without that level jump. Starting with the before.
You broke my heart.
can hear, even with the gain match enabled, listening to these at matched volume, I think you can hear a really distinctive difference in the high frequency, exactly where the emphasis is. And I think you can hear that bass come into a little bit more control. Again, the before here sounded really great. We wanted to just brighten it up and add a little bit more articulation and sparkle and air and control in the low end, but without kind of shoehorning it and trying to make it into something that it's not. Allowing it to be dark and smooth and somber, but with just a little bit more detail. I think Ozone allowed me to do that. The other thing I wanted to mention here is that you have all of these great vintage compressors, EQs, limiters built in here, even a vintage tape machine. I think this EQ is based on the Tube Pultex and the compressor is based on a Fairchild. Wonderful sounding compressors there. I find myself using them a lot. I didn't use them on these particular recreations. So how does Ozone 9 sound compared to Ozone 8? Well, to me, it sounds the same, with the exception of there's some really cool new features. That amazing, I've got to say, amazing master rebalance, which almost like being able to work from stems and pull your vocals, bass and drums up and down slightly. And those are honestly the most important things for me when I'm working from stems. When I need stems from a client, it's usually because, I wish we could just turn up or down that kick drum a hair, up or down that bass a hair, up or down that vocal a hair. The fact that they've built this in here, I think is amazing. I think that's gonna be a game changer for pretty much all mastering engineers. Match EQ, really fun to use, especially to give you really educated guesses educated through machine learning about where to EQ. And then low end focus, try it on a bunch of different tracks, and I think you'll really hear it changing the proportion between kick and bass. Well, I hope this quick walkthrough of Ozone 9 has been useful for you, and I hope you gained some insights on what goes on in making real commercial masters. For me, a few of these key features are really worth the upgrade. The fact that I can add more modules than in past versions of Ozone. The fact that there's this low-end focus, and even more particularly for me, the master rebalance tool. I think those are really worth the price of admission alone. Last, certainly not least, for when you're using Ozone in a DAW, which is often my preferred way to use Ozone, this version is more CPU efficient when you're running it in a DAW, so much less of a chance of you kind of choking up your CPU and having crashing and buggy problems because of the tremendous horsepower that's under the hood here. So another great upgrade for Ozone 9. So could I master an entire track using nothing but Ozone 9? I think the answer is yes. Yes, I certainly could. These mastered clips here, I think if you compare them to the final masters I got for these clients using other tools, this is pretty much as close as it gets. To be honest, you can use almost anything when your skills are developed enough to get really good masters. In fact, in my full-length course on mastering, Mastering Demystified, you can hear me master some tracks on a fancy analog system and then recreate that master using nothing but stock plugins in Pro Tools. Now, I gotta tell you this, iZotope Ozone is a lot more fun to use than stock plugins in Pro Tools. It can also do some things and correct some kinds of problems you'd never be able to correct with stock plugins in Pro Tools, namely that master rebalance, but also things like dynamic EQ. Absolutely love. It's a great way to be more subtle and targeted with EQ. The multiband compressor function, just the flexibility on the multiband compressor in Ozone. I break out that module first pretty much anytime I need a multiband compressor. And of course, one of the most flexible and best sounding limiters I've heard. It really does sound different in all of its 4 major modes. Each one kind of has its own signature tone. Definitely worth checking out. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop in collaboration with iZotope, makers of one of my favorite tools, Ozone, now in its 9th iteration. Did you like this video? If so, remember to like, subscribe, comment. Let us know. Do you want to see more like this? I hope you had fun checking this out. I hope it was useful to you. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.